Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into something really fundamental, how kids actually learn to read with comprehension, not just decoding the words, but truly understanding what they're reading.
That's right. We're going beyond just sounding it out. We're looking at the bigger picture of reading comprehension. And for this deep dive, we're focusing on a rich body of research stemming from a project called Comprehension Tools for Teachers, or CTT for short.
CTT.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell us a bit more about that. What exactly is CTT?
Well, you can think of CTT as a really systematic and comprehensive effort to develop and test interventions specifically designed to boost language and reading comprehension skills in kids from pre-K all the way up to fourth grade.
Oh, pretty wide age range there.
Yes, definitely. And importantly, these interventions were designed to target the core underlying skills that research has consistently shown to be absolutely essential for developing proficient reading comprehension.
Not just any skills, then. These are the ones we know make a real difference.
Precisely. And the driving force behind CTT, the reason this research was undertaken, stems from some pretty concerning statistics. National assessment data consistently show that a significant portion of fourth graders struggle with even basic reading comprehension tasks, whether it's understanding a simple story or grasping the information presented in a nonfiction text.
And we know this issue isn't evenly distributed. It disproportionately affects kids from lower income backgrounds.
Sadly, yes, that's a persistent and troubling gap that this research is ultimately trying to address.
So how did CTT approach this challenge? How did they try to make sense of all the factors involved in reading comprehension?
Well, one way to visualize how CTT conceptualized reading comprehension is through what they call the lattice model.
A lattice model, that sounds intriguing.
It's a way of thinking about reading comprehension as this intricate network of interconnected abilities. You've got cognitive processes, how our brains work and learn. You've got regulatory processes, those skills related to self-monitoring and managing our own learning. Then, of course, you have linguistic processes, our language abilities themselves. And finally, there are text-specific processes, how we approach different genres and types of writing. All of these are interwoven and influence each other in a complex way.
Like a lattice, with all these strands intertwined and supporting each other.
Exactly. Now, an interesting point to note here is that while decoding skills, being able to sound out words, are obviously a foundational part of reading, CTT chose to focus its efforts on other areas.
So they weren't trying to reinvent the wheel when it comes to teaching phonics.
Right. There are already a lot of evidence-based programs out there for teaching decoding. So CTT zoomed in on what they call malleable skills. These are the skills that we know can be improved through targeted instruction.
Malleable, meaning they can be shaped and molded.
Precisely. And these skills range from those that feel almost automatic, like how we naturally apply our understanding of spoken language when we read, to those that are more deliberate and reflective, like being able to analyze the structure of a text.
It's fascinating to think about all the different cognitive gears turning when we read.
Hmm.
So where did CTT begin this deep dive into malleable skills?
Yeah.
What was their first target?
Their first area of focus was morphological awareness training, or MAT. Now, morphological awareness, in a nutshell, is the ability to understand and manipulate the smallest meaningful units in language. We call those units morphemes.
Morphemes.
Mhm.
So we're talking about things like prefixes, suffixes, and root words.
Exactly. Think about the re in reread or the ekful in helpful. They're small, but they pack a lot of meaning. And research has shown that having a strong awareness of these morphemes isn't just helpful for decoding unfamiliar words. It also significantly boosts reading comprehension and even spelling skills.
Those little chunks of language really do a lot of heavy lifting.
They do. Now, what made MAT stand out is that while most of the existing research on morphological awareness had focused on older students, this intervention was specifically designed for much younger learners.
So kindergarten, first, and second graders.
Exactly. And they specifically focused on kids attending high-poverty schools, recognizing that these students might not have had the same opportunities to develop these skills.
It makes sense to target the intervention where it's most needed.
Yeah.
So how do they approach teaching these young kids about something as seemingly abstract as morphemes?
Well, they started with a 9-week design study to refine their methods. Then they conducted an 8-week efficacy trial to really test whether the intervention had a real impact. During these studies, they focused on both inflectional endings like S for plurals or ed for past tense, and those derivational affixes that can change a word's meaning or grammatical category like un, re, or eply.
I remember reading something about a word detective theme. Were they trying to make it fun and engaging for the kids?
Absolutely. The whole intervention was framed around becoming a word detective. It sounds like you've done your homework. Each lesson followed a very structured format with 4 key parts. First, they'd introduce the target affix through listening activities, getting the kids to tune their ears to those sounds. Then they'd move on to word sorting activities, where the kids had to decide which words had the target affix and which didn't. Or they'd explore the affix within the context of a story. This would be followed by a game or a writing activity to really cement their understanding. And each lesson wrapped up with a summary of what they had learned.
So pretty hands-on and interactive then.
Very much so. They even gave the kids magnifying glasses to hunt for those affixes and figure out how they were changing the meanings of words.
I love that. It's like a little linguistic treasure hunt. And they also had review lessons built in, right?
That's right. Every couple of weeks, they'd have these review lessons with discussions and games to revisit the affixes they'd already covered. They even introduced the concept of word relatives, explaining how words could be related through these shared roots and affixes, like members of the same family.
Such a clever way to make those abstract concepts more concrete and relatable. So what did they find? Did this word detective approach actually work?
The results were quite promising. In the efficacy trial, they saw statistically significant gains in morphological awareness across all 3 grade levels. The effect sizes, which basically tell you how much of an impact the intervention had, ranged from small to large, which is pretty impressive for an intervention that was relatively short.
So a good indication that even a brief focus on morphemes can make a real difference.
Definitely. They also observed a small positive effect on reading comprehension in 1st grade and on pseudo-word reading in 2nd grade.
Pseudo-word reading. Remind us what that means again.
Pseudo-words are basically made-up words, words that follow the rules of English but don't have an actual meaning. Being able to read them is a good indicator of decoding skills.
Ah, right. So they were getting better at applying those decoding skills to unfamiliar words. That makes sense.
It does. However, they did see a small negative effect on pseudo-word reading in 1st grade.
Oh, that's interesting. A dip in performance for the 1st graders.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on why that might have happened?
It's possible that for those 1st graders who are still very much in the early stages of learning to read, the focus on meaning units, on those morphemes, might have temporarily shifted their attention away from purely sound-based decoding. It's a delicate balance at that age.
It's like they were so focused on understanding the meaning that they might have lost sight of the sounds for a bit.
Exactly. But importantly, they found that students who started out with lower levels of morphological awareness benefited just as much as those who started with average levels.
So it was a level playing field in terms of who could benefit from the intervention.
Precisely. And this really opens up some interesting questions for future research. For instance, how long do these benefits last? What's the ideal duration and frequency for this type of instruction? There's still a lot to explore.
So Matt gave us a powerful tool to help kids unlock the meaning within words. What's next on the CTT menu?
The next intervention we'll look at is the Dialect Awareness Study, or DAWS. This one delves into the fascinating and complex relationship between spoken dialect variations like African American English, which we often shorten to AAE, and Southern White English, or SWE, and their potential connection to the achievement gap in literacy.
It's fascinating to think about the role dialects play in learning to read. So how does speaking a particular dialect at home affect a child's ability to learn to read standard academic English?
Well, research has shown a link between how consistently students use their home dialect and their overall language and literacy skills. And interestingly, studies have found that students who can dialect shift, meaning they can adapt their language to use mainstream American English, or MAE, in school contexts, tend to do better academically.
So it's not about saying one way of speaking is right or wrong, but about having the flexibility to use the language that's expected in a specific situation, like a classroom.
Precisely. The researchers framed dialect shifting as a metalinguistic skill. It requires understanding the differences between non-mainstream dialects and MAE, both in terms of grammar and structure, but also knowing when it's appropriate to use each. There's a real cognitive awareness involved.
It's like having a mental toolbox with different language tools for different situations.
Exactly. So to develop this ability to shift dialects, they started with an experiment that involved 2 different 4-week interventions, both aimed at helping kids edit text to conform to MAE.
So both groups were learning the same standard grammar rules, but the instruction differed.
Right. One group received explicit instruction, where they directly compared specific features of their home dialect with their counterparts in MAE. They even used a clever analogy comparing home English to comfortable everyday clothes and school English to more formal attire to drive home the point about using different language styles in different settings. The other group received implicit instruction on the same grammatical features, but without this direct comparison or the focus on context.
It sounds like that explicit group had more of a meta-awareness of the different dialects.
That was the idea. And when it came to the specific grammatical features they targeted, they focused on areas where non-mainstream dialects often differ from MAE, like using plural s, past tense ed, and the verb to be.
So things like saying two book instead of two books, or he going instead of he is going.
Exactly. And what they found was that both groups showed improvements in their ability to use MAE in their writing and editing, indicating that dialect shifting is a teachable skill. However, the group that received explicit instruction with the direct comparisons and the dress analogy showed significantly more dialect shifting than the implicit group.
So explicitly addressing those dialect differences and the social context seems to be more effective.
That's what the data suggests. Building on these results, they developed an expanded 8-week DAWS intervention covering 6 grammatical features, including things like past tense, plural markers, subject-verb agreement, and possessives. And they kept that same daily lesson format with explicit instruction and a focus on context.
And did they make sure that the kids participating in the study actually used non-mainstream dialects?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was a key inclusion criterion. They only included students who demonstrated use of at least one feature of a non-mainstream dialect in a writing sample or on a language screening measure. Then they randomly assigned these kids to either the DOS intervention or a control group.
So a well-controlled study to really isolate the effects of the intervention. And what did they find? Did this expanded DAWS program make a difference?
The results were in line with their initial findings. Students who received the DAWS intervention used significantly more MAE forms and fewer non-mainstream dialect forms in their writing compared to the control group. They were becoming more adept at using the language patterns expected in academic settings. And perhaps most importantly, they found that the ability to dialect shift actually predicted reading comprehension, both directly and indirectly through its positive influence on morphological awareness, which takes us back to our discussion about MAT.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful link. It suggests that being able to navigate these different ways of speaking isn't just about grammar. It actually supports deeper reading comprehension.
It really underscores how linguistic flexibility, being comfortable with different language styles, can have a ripple effect on literacy development.
It's like opening up a whole new dimension of language understanding. Okay, so we've seen how understanding word parts and being aware of dialect variations can play a crucial role in reading comprehension. What's next on the CTT agenda?
Next up, we have language in motion, or LIM. This intervention tackles something called decontextualized language, which is often a stumbling block for young readers.
Decontextualized language. That sounds a bit like a mouthful. Break that down for us.
Think about the language you typically encounter in academic settings and written texts. It's often very different from the language we use in everyday conversations. It tends to be more formal, more abstract, and less reliant on immediate visual cues or shared experiences for meaning.
So it's like the language you might find in a textbook where everything has to be spelled out because you don't have that shared context with the reader.
Yeah, exactly. And for students who haven't had as much exposure to this type of language, it can be a real barrier to comprehension. LIM was specifically designed for kids with below-average language abilities, kids who might not qualify for formal language impairment services, but still need that extra boost to access this more challenging language.
It's about catching those kids who fall through the cracks, who might not meet the criteria for special education, but still need support.
Precisely. And they developed both 12-week and 9-week versions of LIM for kids ranging from pre-K to 3rd grade. The intervention is organized around 4 units, and each unit zeroes in on a specific aspect of syntax or sentence structure. For example, pre-K might work on using adverbs that describe how actions are performed, like quickly or softly.
So each unit has a very specific grammatical target. But how do they make learning about grammar fun and engaging for young learners? I mean, sentence structure isn't exactly the most thrilling topic for a 5-year-old.
Well, they cleverly embedded these grammatical targets within engaging, age-appropriate stories that were specifically crafted for the intervention. The idea was to maximize student engagement and give them tons of opportunities to hear and use the targeted sentence structures in meaningful real-world contexts.
And that's where the in-motion part comes in, right?
Yeah,
I recall reading about a connection to science concepts and a lot of hands-on activities.
you got it. They integrated science concepts related to motion, things like rolling, friction, and forces, and they used a ton of hands-on props and visuals. For instance, first graders might use a marble run to experiment with different forces, and the stories they hear would tie into themes like amusement park rides or circus performances. And even in third grade, they use these large illustrations of a spooky mystery house with movable furniture to help illustrate concepts related to Newton's laws of motion.
That sounds so much more engaging than just sitting at a desk doing grammar worksheets. So they're learning about sentence structure through these stories and by actually experiencing scientific concepts firsthand.
That's the essence of LIM. And the structure of the activities was pretty consistent across the grade levels, although, of course, the complexity of the language increased as the kids got older. And importantly, they built in a lot of differentiation strategies so teachers could easily adjust the level of support or challenge based on individual student needs.
That flexibility is so crucial in a classroom setting. And I also remember reading something about a focus on mental state verbs, words like wonder or decide. How did those fit into the limb picture?
Those mental state verbs are really important because they're closely linked to developing more complex sentence structures. So they directly taught and modeled those words, making sure the kids understood how to use them correctly. In the early grades, the focus was on simple understanding and use within those stories and activities. But in second and third grade, they added another layer by having the kids compare and contrast different mental state verbs based on how certain they were, like understanding that know expresses more certainty than think.
That's a really subtle but important nuance of language. It's like teaching them to be more mindful of the shades of meaning in their words.
Exactly. So, to assess the effectiveness of LIM, they started with those design studies where they implemented the units, got feedback from teachers, revised them, and then tested them again with new groups of students. And the results from their curriculum-based assessments show that the kids were making significant improvements in their ability to use and understand those targeted syntactic structures.
So the design studies gave them encouraging initial results, but
Huh?
they didn't stop there.
Right. They followed up with more rigorous randomized efficacy trials using the full 12-week interventions in pre-K through first grade. And these trials showed positive trends and, in some cases, statistically significant improvements on measures of those specific syntactic structures they were teaching, as well as on measures of listening comprehension. They even saw favorable trends on standardized tests of syntax and listening comprehension in most of the grades.
So it seems like LIM is hitting the mark in terms of improving those specific grammar skills. And perhaps even more importantly, it seems to be having a broader positive impact on overall language abilities, especially for those younger learners.
That's the takeaway so far. They're continuing to research and refine the intervention to see if they can even further boost its impact on overall language development.
It's exciting to see how these interventions are evolving. So what's the next CTT intervention we should delve into?
Next, we have COMPASS, which stands for Comprehension Monitoring and Providing Awareness of Story Structure. This intervention focuses on two key aspects of reading comprehension. First, the metacognitive skill of comprehension monitoring, and second, the text-specific skill of understanding narrative text structure, which is often referred to as story grammar.
Comprehension monitoring. That sounds like being able to check in with yourself while you're reading or listening to something and ask, am I actually getting this?
That's a great way to put it. It's the ability to actively evaluate your own understanding. Researchers often give a simple example. A story about a character who wants to go outside to play, but then they're told it's snowing heavily. If the character then proceeds to go outside wearing shorts and a t-shirt, a child with good comprehension monitoring skills would flag that as being inconsistent, something that doesn't quite make sense.
They'd be like, hold on, something's not right here.
Exactly. But a lot of kids, especially those who struggle with reading, might not even notice those inconsistencies. And that's what Compass aims to develop, that ability to be a critical listener and reader. And it's important to remember that comprehension monitoring isn't just about reading. It's an oral language skill that starts developing well before kids even begin to read.
So it's about training those little ears to be more attentive and to recognize when something doesn't add up, even when they're just listening to a story.
That's right. Now, the other component of Compass is understanding story structure, or story grammar. This refers to those common elements that are present in most stories. Things like the characters, the setting, the initiating event, the problem, the attempts to solve the problem, and the resolution.
It's like having a mental roadmap for how stories typically unfold.
Exactly. And when kids have a good grasp of story structure, it helps them organize the information they encounter, make sense of the plot, analyze the characters' actions, and even make allowances about what might happen next.
So it's like having a set of mental scaffolding to build their understanding upon. How did Compass go about teaching these skills?
They created both 8-week and 10-week versions of Compass for kids in pre-K through third grade. The lessons were highly structured using that I do, we do, you do scaffolding approach. And the lesson plans were very detailed to ensure consistency across different teachers and classrooms. For the comprehension monitoring component, they used short, original stories, some with inconsistencies and some without. They started with illustrations to support understanding, but gradually faded those out as the kids progressed. And the teachers explicitly told the kids to stop and ask questions whenever something didn't make sense.
So encouraging them to be active listeners and not be afraid to voice their confusion.
Precisely. For the text structure component, they used 8 unique stories for each grade level, each with a clear story structure, relatable characters, and age-appropriate themes. They used illustrations, asked lots of questions during reading, and had the kids retell the stories in their own words to check for understanding. They also explicitly taught those story grammar elements using visual aids and even a catchy song. Plus, the teachers modeled effective narrative retelling.
A song about story structure. That's a great way to make it stick. What did the research tell us about how well Compass worked?
Their initial design studies, which involved smaller groups of kids, showed that after just 4 weeks, the kids were getting better at both detecting those inconsistencies in stories and demonstrating knowledge of story structure. But when they conducted a larger, more rigorous efficacy study with pre-K through first grade students, they found a statistically significant positive effect on comprehension monitoring for the intervention group, but they didn't see a significant impact on story structure knowledge.
It's interesting. One part worked as expected, but the other didn't quite pan out in the efficacy trial. Why do you think that might be?
It's hard to say for sure. It's possible that the instruction on text structure just wasn't intense enough or long enough to produce a measurable impact on listening comprehension within the time frame of the study. It's also worth considering how they measured story structure knowledge. They primarily relied on oral retelling, which might not be the most sensitive measure, especially for those younger kids. For older kids who are already reading independently, you might use other assessments like story maps or having them rearrange scrambled story elements.
So the way you assess these skills can make a big difference. But even though the text structure component didn't show a significant effect in this particular study, it seems like that explicit focus on comprehension monitoring had a real impact, even with the relatively short intervention.
Exactly. Just a few weeks of explicit instruction can help those young learners become more aware of their own understanding and more likely to catch those comprehension breakdowns.
That's a powerful takeaway. Now we have a couple more CTT interventions to explore. Let's move on to TEC-XTS, which stands for Teaching Expository Text Structures. So far, we've talked a lot about narratives, but expository texts are a whole different ballgame, right? They're more about conveying information and facts.
Absolutely. While understanding story grammar is great for narrative comprehension, expository texts, the kind you find in informational books and textbooks, don't always follow such a neat and predictable structure. And that's where TEC-TS comes in. It was specifically designed to help kindergarten, first, and second graders with below-average listening or reading comprehension skills get a better handle on those underlying organizational patterns in expository texts.
So instead of focusing on characters and plot, we're now looking at how information is organized and presented.
Precisely. They focused on several common text structures identified in research, like sequencing, which describes things in a specific order, cause and effect, compare and contrast, and problem and solution.
It's like learning to decode the underlying architecture of informational writing.
That's a great analogy. And the idea behind text-TS is that by becoming aware of these common text structures and the specific clue words or connectives that often signal them, words like first, because, or however, kids can develop a deeper understanding of those relationships within the text.
So they're learning to spot those linguistic signposts that guide the reader.
Exactly. And they targeted this intervention specifically at young readers who might not have grasped these organizational patterns implicitly yet.
So more explicit instruction then.
Absolutely. Lots of modeling, guided practice, and independent practice. For instance, when teaching sequencing, they'd use text with lots of temporal language, directly teach those sequence clue words like first, next, and last, and use graphic organizers to help the kids visualize and retell the information in the correct order.
It sounds like they're really giving those kids the tools to unpack those complex informational texts.
Hmm.
So how did TechTS fare in their pilot testing?
The results were encouraging. They found that text-TS was feasible to implement, even with those kindergartners. And the kids showed significant improvement in their ability to identify and retell those clue words associated with the text structure they'd been taught, compared to a text structure they hadn't learned about. The effect sizes were quite large, indicating a substantial impact.
That's impressive. So even those young learners were able to grasp those text structure concepts.
They were. And they also saw significant growth on a standardized measure of oral language, and in most of the groups, improvement in listening comprehension.
That's a great sign, suggesting that learning about text structure might have broader benefits beyond just reading comprehension.
It does seem to have that potential. It's like they're developing a more sophisticated understanding of how language works to convey information.
Okay, we have two more CTT interventions to cover. Let's dive into ERC, enacted reading comprehension. This one sounds particularly unique.
ERC is fascinating because it's rooted in the idea that our understanding of language is deeply intertwined with our physical experiences, with our bodies. The basic premise is that we understand language, at least in part, by creating internal simulations of what the words describe.
So it's like when I read the sentence, "the child threw the ball." I'm not just processing the words, I'm also creating a mental image, perhaps even a slight physical sensation of that action.
Precisely. And the research suggests that this kind of simulation isn't limited to concrete actions. It also plays a role in our understanding of more abstract concepts. Now, ERC takes this idea of embodied cognition and applies it to reading comprehension, specifically for third and fourth graders. But it goes beyond just those internal simulations. It actually involves incorporating physical movements.
So we're talking about getting kids up and moving while they're reading.
In a way, yes, but not in a theatrical, acting out the story kind of way. The key to ERC is using hand and arm motions to simulate the content of the text, rather than manipulating objects.
So more like using gestures to represent the ideas.
Exactly. And they applied this approach to a variety of texts, including science texts and even a novel.
I'm really curious about how that worked in practice. Can you give us some examples of the kinds of gestures the kids were using?
Absolutely. The ERC intervention was divided into 3 phases. In the first phase, they worked with science texts about things like earthquakes and hurricanes. They used specific hand gestures to represent the forces involved. Like for an earthquake, they might push their hands together to simulate the colliding tectonic plates. Or for a hurricane, they might make swirling motions with their arms to represent the air masses.
It's almost like they're conducting a mini science experiment with their bodies.
You could say that. The second phase focused on understanding persuasive texts. They used the concept of opposing forces to represent arguments and counter-arguments. Like, each hand might represent a different side of the debate, and the kids would move their hands back and forth to show which argument was winning.
That's a brilliant way to make something as abstract as a debate more concrete and visual.
It is, isn't it? And the third phase involved reading a novel, a single shard. Here, the kids used gestures to represent the character's internal thoughts, feelings, and conflicts.
So the gestures become a way to externalize those internal struggles and make them more tangible.
Precisely. And in their design studies with third and fourth graders who could decode words adequately but struggled with comprehension, they saw significant gains in content knowledge across all 3 phases of the intervention.
That's promising. It suggests that engaging the body in this way can actually deepen understanding.
The initial findings definitely point in that direction. They did conduct a larger efficacy study, but the results weren't available yet at the time of this publication.
Well, that's definitely something to watch for. It sounds like ERC could be a real game changer for kids who are stuck in that decoding rut, but not really grasping the meaning. Now we have one final CTT intervention to explore, CAAI, which stands for Content Area Literacy Instruction. This one sounds like it bridges the gap between literacy skills and learning about specific subjects.
It does. ALI was developed for kids in kindergarten through 4th grade with the ambitious goal of not just improving their reading comprehension, but also building their content knowledge in science and social studies, enhancing their higher-order thinking skills, teaching them to use comprehension strategies effectively, improving their expository writing, and just boosting their overall knowledge acquisition.
So it's a very holistic approach, recognizing that reading comprehension isn't just about decoding words, it's about using those words to learn and understand the world around us.
Exactly. They hypothesized that teaching those comprehension skills in the context of actually learning about science and social studies would be a particularly powerful approach. And the current version of CLI is the culmination of 4 design studies where they continually refined their methods based on classroom observations and student outcomes.
It sounds like they were very meticulous in their approach. So how is CLI structured?
In the current model, each science or social studies topic is broken down into 2 3-week units, and the instruction is delivered in small, flexible groups based on the student's comprehension skills.
So they're tailoring the instruction to meet the needs of different learners.
Exactly. And the daily lessons are short, usually 20 to 30 minutes, 4 days a week. Each unit is driven by a set of big, overarching questions to focus the learning. And discussion plays a central role in every lesson. They use specific strategies to get the kids talking and actively participating.
It sounds like they're really emphasizing the importance of oral language in collaborative learning.
They are. Now, the lessons within each 3-week unit follow a 4-phase framework based on that well-known 5E learning cycle: connect, clarify, research, and apply.
Okay, walk us through those 4 phases. What happens in each one?
Sure. So in the connect phase, the teacher's job is to bridge the gap between those complex academic concepts and the kids' own experiences and prior knowledge. So for example, if they're studying economics with 4th graders, they might start by talking about something familiar like Disney World or the beaches in Florida to help the kids understand how tourism contributes to a state's economy. Then in the clarify phase, they use leveled texts. So everyone's reading about the same core content, but the texts are available at 3 different levels of difficulty. And these texts are designed to explicitly teach those informational text reading skills and how to make inferences. They highlight those expository text structures we talked about earlier, and the kids keep these books in their researchers' notebooks.
So differentiated instruction, but with everyone working towards the same learning goals.
That's the idea. Then comes the research phase, where the kids get to engage in hands-on experiments in science or interact with primary source materials in social studies. And they use those clarify books as guides during these activities. Finally, in the apply phase, they get to synthesize and analyze everything they've learned through projects. Like in that economics unit, they might design their own lemonade stand, applying those economic principles they've been learning about.
It's about taking those abstract concepts and making them concrete and relevant to their own lives.
Exactly. And in their large-scale CLI efficacy study with kindergarten through 4th graders, they found a significant positive effect on content knowledge gains in both social studies and science. And the effect sizes actually increased with grade level.
So the older kids were showing even bigger gains in content knowledge.
That's right. And when they dug deeper into the data, they found that these increases in content knowledge had a direct positive effect on the kids' overall reading comprehension scores.
That's a crucial finding. It means that building knowledge in these subject areas can actually translate into improvements in reading comprehension across the board.
It does seem to work that way. They did note that CALI didn't have the anticipated direct effect on oral language skills, which could be due to the specific measures they used, or perhaps because academic knowledge building doesn't immediately impact those more automatic aspects of language. But the key takeaway is that increasing academic knowledge is a malleable skill, and it can support learning from text regardless of a child's initial knowledge base or reading skills.
So even if a child struggles with decoding, building their background knowledge can help them compensate and still extract meaning from what they're reading.
Precisely. It can open up a whole new pathway to comprehension.
So looking across all of these interventions that CTT has developed, what would you say is the most significant overall message?
I think the overarching goal of CTT was to provide teachers with a diverse toolkit of well-researched, targeted interventions to support students who are struggling with reading comprehension. And what we've seen is that focusing on these specific foundational skills, whether it's understanding word parts, becoming aware of dialect variations, mastering complex sentence structures, learning to monitor comprehension, recognizing text organization, incorporating movement, or building background knowledge, can all contribute to positive changes.
And it seems like the initial assessments of those very specific skills targeted by each intervention generally showed stronger effects than those broader measures of overall reading comprehension, at least in the short term.
That's a fair observation. But the research suggests that these interventions can have both direct and indirect effects on reading comprehension, which really supports that lattice model we talked about earlier. All these skills are interwoven and influence each other.
It really highlights the interconnected nature of reading comprehension. It's not one single ability, but this intricate web of skills that we can target and nurture.
Yeah.
So What's next for CTT? Where does the research go from here?
Right now, they're conducting comparative efficacy studies to see which of these individual interventions work best for.